Hi there. So, my restaurant table story is that a few years ago, I had started dating this guy, and he was really, really into music. I worked at a radio station at the time, and I just happened to book Peter Hook, the bassist from New Order and Joy Division, for an interview. Joy Division and New Order were a couple of my date's favourite bands. Anyway, Peter Hook hadn't turned up that day. Later on, when I'm sitting at the restaurant table, Peter Hook calls my cell phone to apologise. When I hung up, I said to my date, that was Peter Hook, and he was so impressed, and I looked incredibly cool. We carried on dating, and we had this running joke because my date was also really into cooking, and he had this favourite wooden spatula. This is just like our random sense of humour. The wooden spatula was wearing out and he wasn't going to be able to use it for cooking anymore. So we had this running joke that every time someone famous came into the radio station, he would say, "Get him to sign my spatula," so that he could keep it and frame it. One day I managed to get Peter Hook to sign the spatula, and he put down to Jason, "Happy beating and lots of love, Peter Hook, kiss, kiss, kiss." It's 20 years later now, and we've got a house and a dog, and most importantly, an 11-year-old little boy. And I think it all started from that moment when I looked incredibly cool in front of my date at the restaurant table.
And as they teach you in journalism school, every story should have a strong hook.
Heard, Chef.
Chef Heard.
We've started every episode of Heard with these wonderful tales from the table. And now we're passing the mic to you. If you visit our Instagram page, there's a simple link in our bio at Heard_podcast. All you have to do is click the section that says Tales from the Table and leave us a voice message of your best memories, your best moments, your life-changing experiences that happened around the table. The best stories will be featured across season 2 of Heard. So let's spread the love for restaurants.
What'd you say? Heard. I got that, don't worry.
Okay.
Heard, Chef. Got 20 chicken all day.
I'm Ryan King, and I've been writing about chefs and the world of gastronomy for the last 15 years. I've been on a bit of a mission to find examples of restaurants where leaders are creating great cultures across their teams. And if you've been listening to this podcast from the beginning, I'm sure at certain points you might have sat back and thought, who the hell is this guy who's never worked a day in his life in a professional kitchen, conjuring up this angelic model where all the chefs are happy, there's no stress, and everyone goes home after 40 hours, only working a 4-day week. You might even be laughing at me right now. But what if I was to tell you, these restaurants do exist? That it is in fact possible to balance solid economics with solid ethics, and that actually building a team-first restaurant improves performance, staff retention, and creativity in the kitchen. You might think I was mad, at least a little naive, but I found a place and a leader who's been working on building this very type of restaurant for years.
Nobody's got a perfect culture, and anybody that says that they do is kidding themselves. But it is the main part of our business to try to be good, not bad.
Ben Shewry is the chef, and along with his wife Kylie, the owner of Attica in Melbourne. It's one of a very few restaurants that actually runs as a B Corp, and this means that the company is certified for their social, societal and environmental impact rather than being driven solely by financial profit. Ben and Kylie believe that you can run a restaurant as a force for good, and sometimes that doesn't go down very well.
When we made these changes, we were ridiculed for it. And I remember meeting a group of English chefs that called us a bunch of pussies.
Ben's really not the kind of guy who cares what other people think. And he's fairly confident that the winds of change blow firmly in his favour.
You can get on board and change for the right reasons, or that change will come for you, and you won't have a place here anymore.
Ben's an author as well as a chef, and his latest book, Uses for Obsession, is sort of part memoir and partly his own manifesto on how to run a restaurant for high performance. In this episode, you're going to get Ben's take on how, as a leader, you can create a truly great workplace.
It's never too late to change, and it's never too late to be better.
This is Heard, the podcast that aims to put the rest in restaurants. Ben really doesn't hold back in his book. Coming up, you're going to hear him taking aim at some of the structures around restaurants that he says create too much pressure for people who are working in an already high-pressured environment.
Restaurants need to be far more equal places. Whatever restaurant guides are in a person's city, they seriously contribute to that pressure. And that's not hyperbole, that's fact. We all know this. Crushing somebody and breaking somebody's soul, that's not about performance, that's about stupidity. We are not tortured artists. That is not an acceptable mentality. I'm not going to get into it with people in the comment section. I could give a shit. I've been around a long time, so I've got a pretty thick skin, Ryan.
I think you can hear already that Ben simply will not tolerate the faintest whiff of injustice. And he's heard a lot about this injustice across the industry from many other chefs that have actually approached him while he was traveling the world on his recent book tour.
I've met people who have had a really hard time in kitchens and have left the industry, and they tell me their stories, and that's made me reflect on my younger years, which were very rough, and I felt like a total outsider, like I didn't fit in. And I wondered how I made it through. I look back on that with a little bit of sadness, just a young boy or a young man who was just very lost, but who loved cooking and couldn't understand why this wasn't all about cooking. You know, this is about other things like drinking or being a bully sometimes it felt like, or being part of a bro club. And I just never really fitted in.
It is really sad. We see that in the comments as well. And it's like, what do you do to that when people are like, look, this was my biggest passion and I had to leave after 16-hour days and missing the growing up of my child or missing really important moments. And there's got to be a better way. No, there's got to be a way in which you can run successful restaurants, still be passionate, still be obsessive, but not break everybody in the chain of command.
Obsession's not a bad thing. Ambition's not a bad thing. But when it's blind and egotistical, that's when it can really become a toxic thing. Those of us with privilege who have people who follow them need to understand that responsibility, because it's a pretty grave one to have young people or any people of any age in your employ who look up to you and admire you and would do arguably just about anything for you. You need to understand that relationship, I think, as a employer and as a mentor. I write that, really like this is kind of our blueprint for a restaurant. And I have these lists of do's and don'ts in my book.
Which I loved, by the way.
Thank you. They're pretty spicy and sometimes sharp. But really, it's just that we won't do this forever, but we're a school for the future. That's how we view it. We don't get it right all the time. It's not like we're some perfect restaurant with no issues. All cultures are constantly evolving and working on, and nobody's got a perfect culture, and anybody that says that they do is kidding themselves. But it is the main part of our business, probably actually, is to try to be good. Not bad. And knowing that we're flawed as humans and we'll fail, and that's frustrating, but the next day you get to have a crack. Any serious issues, though, need to be dealt with properly. We cannot push things under the carpet anymore. And so for business owners and managers and leaders, there's a little bit of fearlessness required to not walk past things, to not let things happen to people who are in your care that you have a responsibility for. And so, really, since I took ownership of the restaurant in 2015, it's just kind of been this period of the reasoned questioning of everything, of every standard, of every habit of our industry. And that doesn't make us perfect, but it does make us very curious and very keen to try to see if there was another way to do this. And one of the first changes we made pretty much immediately was to move everybody to a 4-day working week.
How achievable is it to run a 4-day week like that for the staff? What are the difficulties? What are the positives of that? How long have you been doing that for?
We've been doing it for nearly 10 years. And I think it's not too difficult at all. One of the frustrating things that I hear, and I do address this in my book, is that, well, you're Attica, of course you can do that. And I don't like that line. First of all, because we were one of the worst restaurants. We had only 2 staff when we started, 2 in the kitchen, 2 on the floor. We've come from a long way back. And reasonably good restaurants, just as a broad brushstroke, if they're doing reasonably well, they're all making about the same profit. Like the margins are about the same in most restaurants in this business. And then it really becomes down to the decision of the owners about how they will spend that profit, or are they prepared to have a reduction in that profit to provide a better lifestyle for their employees? And essentially that's the question, right? That's the question. When something's successful, is it equitable? Does everybody share in that? Or is it really solely a money-driven enterprise? And if you want to grow the industry, if you want to look at a long-term vision for it, if it matters to you what happens once you're out of it, then it's a no-brainer. And I think like my definition of business is pretty much that there's always going to be lots and lots of problems. And for me, that was just another problem to solve. But I also wanted to prove that at high end, at least, that this could be done, because it really hadn't been done before. And, I'd averaged 75 hours a week across my career, which meant when I turned 40, I'd already worked the retirement age hours of a regular person retiring at 65. And that has a pretty significant toll on you financially, because I didn't get paid for them. And you've got paid for half of those hours mentally and physically. So we can't continue to repeat the mistakes of the past. And just because things happen to us in life doesn't mean that we should or have to perpetuate them to others. We're really not talking about anything particularly special or revolutionary here either. I think it's just kind of about basic decency, Ryan.
Do you also follow this rule? Because I meet so many chefs who are like, okay, yeah, my whole team works a 4-day week, but then they don't because something in them doesn't allow them to also have that same time off.
It isn't really about whether or not I follow that rule, because I'm the owner, and I have full responsibility. I would say that my life is incredibly complicated and busy, and I make it that way. I'm certainly no martyr, Ryan. Like, this is the life, man. We wake up each day, we choose it. Most of us, not all of us, but like, we choose this. We choose to return to that job. I choose each day to run this business. Each day I wake up and I choose it again. But I also do a whole heap of other things, like I write books, I am a brand ambassador, I work on the speaking circuit, public speaking. So, there's a bunch of other stuff, and I need to do like a bunch of work at the restaurant because that's what this restaurant requires. It does require an intense focus from the owner to maintain standards, and also because the way that I've built the restaurant is being here a lot and being with the team and helping to motivate them. So they like it when I'm here. I like being around them. We have an amazing team. So it's not really like a question of whether or not I work 38 hours. I don't know too many people running high performance businesses who are responsible for high performance businesses that work 38 hours.
You mentioned the whole set the standard, and that always comes out. It's that setting a standard for the other staff, but I could challenge you a little bit on that and say, set the example. Because I remember you telling me that your team struggled with this when you first brought it in. Am I right in thinking, I remember an old conversation we had?
I just think that there needs to be a very, very clear delineation between employee and employer. They're different things. So we can go around on this, but in business, you will only get out what you put in. Like, that is a fact. We can have a fight about it.
I just care for you as well, man. I just care for you.
No, but
I just want you to have a break.
What I'm saying is, I don't have to do this. I'm choosing to do this. And that's a different thing than being somebody who's kind of newish to the industry and really admires a well-known chef and will go in and work for them for 70 or 80 hours and only be paid for 40. Like that.
If they're paid for 40, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in Europe, often it's completely unpaid. All living in a house together.
They're not a real business. That's not a business. That's something else. I'm not sure what it is, but that's not a long-term thing either. A real business is founded on on some fundamental things, some ethics, and they should be, in my opinion, number one, the people. When we made these changes, I just couldn't accept that being super tired and working a heap of hours was performance. We need rest and recovery to perform at a really high level. When we made these changes so long ago now, we were ridiculed for it. And I remember meeting a group of English chefs that called us a bunch of pussies. Like my sous chef at the time and I were on this trip, and there was some English chefs, and they said, "You guys are super soft and you're all a bunch of pussies because you don't work really extreme hours." And I'm like, okay, then I guess I am. You know what I mean? Like, that's fine. If that's what you think.
Because you wear those, the industry kind of wears the scars as a badge of honor, no?
It's ridiculous.
A weird, there's something happening there, isn't there, of like wearing that toughness, wearing that negativity on the body as a badge of honor. It's a really strange psychology.
Yeah, it's very uncool. Like, I guess the way I've always tried to view it is that this is my profession. Cooking is what I love. I would like to be able to do it for a really long time. And, I'm 48 now, and I have been doing it for a long time. I first set foot in a professional kitchen when I was 10 years old. And when I had the opportunity and the responsibility to do it a different way, I just thought, we'll see if we can. And it wasn't that hard.
And what do you notice amongst the team now? I mean, is performance increased? Because I think people don't realize how much of an impact that can have.
Well, performance can be increased by harmony and by empathy. And so it's not just that you work a reasonable day for a reasonable day's pay. It's also like what other mechanisms that you bring into the workplace and ways of building culture. Because culture is really the number one most significant thing to build performance. Culture, the way people feel about their work environment, about the mission of the business. When you look at the issues in our industry and in business more generally, in totality, they're overwhelming. It's almost like it's too big to fix all these things. And if you try to fix them all at once, it is too big. Our story and my advice to people is to just tackle these issues one at a time. Just small things, one at a time, fix them properly. And chefs and hospitality people are super creative, and creativity is the answer, and imagination is the answer to all of the problems that we face, not just in our industry, but in the world. And so we apply lots of creative solutions to cooking and to serving and to maintenance in restaurants. We just need to have a little bit of a paradigm shift where we also apply those to our lives, to our culture, to the big issues in order to overcome them. And that's what we've done across the last 15 years here. One by one, we've sort of met our fears, we've faced them. And every time that we've been through a tough situation, we just sit down and kind of workshop it in a very simple way. None of these things are overly complicated. And you just tackle them one at a time, very simply. And before you know it, the years pass or the months pass, and you've created a really significant change.
Chef.
Heard.
For me, it's super impressive how committed Ben is to creating such a positive culture in his restaurant. For 15 years, he's had his eye on the prize of high performance in the kitchen and across the business, but in a way that will not drag everyone down around him. This idea that everyone's broken in the pursuit of that prize doesn't happen with Ben and his team. And the way Ben has approached this reminds me of the advice you've heard in previous episodes from people like the elite performance coach, Dr. Julie Gerner. Julie's a psychologist who's worked with some of the world's top executives. These people who also work in extremely high-pressured environments, just like you.
Change doesn't happen by snapping your fingers and everything shifts. It happens by incremental adjustments. And what I would probably do is to say, let's kind of make ourselves a list. And then we just start making little incremental changes that feel like something you can execute. Because if they're not something you feel you can execute, if I said, oh, tomorrow I want you to reorganize your kitchen in a way that's not hard, like that's going to be chaos and it's not going to happen and it's unrealistic. And that's not the way that things work. But you think about a volume dial, we're going to just shift it from like an 8 to a 7. How do we do that? And let's like talk about that shift. So if we get it from an 8 to a 7, do we start to see that service is smoother? Things get a little bit better. Maybe you have one less dish sent back or whatever it is. So we start looking at the impact of incremental adjustments. Usually people are willing to make them when they're their ideas. And so I would ask you to tell me a little bit about how we could do X or how we might, instead of doing X, we try Y.
Attica's been doing this for a long time now. But if you're at the start of this journey, where do you begin? How do you break it down in a way that Julie just described? Herd is all about giving you the stepping stones to do just that. So, I wanted some examples from Ben of the kind of things he's tackled at Attica down the years.
Restaurants need to be far more equal places. So make sure you hire for gender balance. Women have not had a seat at the table in restaurants, not in restaurant ownership. I think 93% of restaurants in Australia, I believe I saw the statistic a few months ago, owned by men. It's a really damning statistic. And so the responsibility for that to change kind of rests with the people that have the power. We need to make sure that we have a gender balance in the front of house and in the kitchen, not only because that's fair, but because that also leads to a more harmonious balance. If it gets too far out one way or the other, we find it doesn't work as well. That's just the simplest thing, and anybody can do that. Bigger issues like the age-old conundrum of the dynamic between the kitchen and the dining room. You've read the book, so you remember the chapter called Staff Speeches, where Attica team meets weekly, and there's a roster where somebody gets to give a speech. Everybody in the team gets to give a speech eventually across the year, and they can speak about anything they want. And the team listens intently and then asks questions afterwards. And that's a device that is there so that employees don't feel like numbers. They feel heard, but also so that we can get to know each other. We can more easily feel empathy for each other. And then when that fiery blow up maybe happens in service, let's say that you and I had heard each other talk, Ryan, but we didn't really know each other. The best example would be like, maybe you give a staff speech here about cats. And then I'm listening to it and I'm like, I don't know, Ryan, but like I really like cats, you know? And then you come into my pastry section as a bar person or something, and something goes wrong. And in the past, maybe we would have had an argument about it, but we both remember that we like cats and we remembered to cool the jets a little bit. And we found that's something we've done to build empathy, also to increase performance because we're more connected. And therefore, you know, we're more ready for our guests. And so we've found that to be revolutionary. That's a bigger idea. A very simple one would be many, many years ago, I remember that we had knockoff drinks here, and I don't think it's really particularly safe or a healthy idea for employees to be on the premises after it's closed drinking. That can only lead to trouble. And that happened. And so we banned knockoff drinks here. So people who only have a drink here in their professional capacity. And some people listening might be going, oh, but I'll lose my team. And like, we didn't lose anybody. I think I've had one person complain to me about it in 15 years, and they weren't the right person for our team.
Have you got a few examples of some of the speeches that have been delivered during this open session that you have?
I mean, I should say what a tremendous privilege to hear people's stories, and just some of the most profound, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes hilarious speeches. A very, very sweet and semi-regular speech is somebody who's come to Attica from a different country, to whom English is a second or third language. And those people making those speeches are really just trying their guts out. But if they're struggling, the whole team is kind of egging them on, you know, they're really, really supportive and kind. And so sometimes it's not about what's said. Sometimes it's about somebody's effort. Other times could be like our head chef, Matt Boyle, who's now in his 13th year here. And Matt has given this long history of speeches about his love for the Richmond Football Club. It's an AFL team here, and Attica's made up of about 20 people that are from a different place and about 20 people that are born or have moved, who are Australian citizens. And so he will then try to sort of round up anybody who's a new Australian to become a supporter of his footy club. And he does sort of enticement sweepstakes. That's always very funny. I remember the day that a person shared with us that they were bipolar and that just how difficult it was for them to hold it together and get through the day. And, there wasn't a dry eye in the house that day. Everybody, I think, really appreciated the bravery that it took to share that. We've heard all sorts of things. We've heard a lot of speeches about depression and suicide, and chronic sexism has been frequent as well. And that is part of the reason why I deal with that subject in the book as well, because again, as a leader, you can't walk past it. You feel heartbroken that happened to these wonderful people, and this cycle needs to kind of stop. So it needs to stop with you. It needs to stop in your business. That's why I say any serious issues in a restaurant need to be thoroughly handled.
I also love it because not only does it make you connect and have empathy for your fellow colleagues, there's a vulnerability to presenting, and there's a vulnerability to standing there and sharing a story. And I find that there's something about like that vulnerability is very attractive. When you're presented with it, the answer I find is often to be vulnerable in return, because it leaves a sort of feeling in your body. I love to play that game at the table sometimes where I'm going to be radically vulnerable right now on purpose, just to see how people react. And often what happens is people start sharing stuff that you're like, I never expected to get that from our first dinner date. So I love that what that does is it's vulnerable leadership in a way. It's a way of expressing vulnerability together. And I think that's really powerful.
Thank you. No, it's a special thing. It's just a human thing as well, right? Like we all go through stuff, and sometimes to hear a little bit about somebody else's experience. There's a saying that is a favorite of mine, to the team, is that, hey, we've all worked really hard to be here, but some of us have had to work that much harder just to be at the same place, and that reflects the experience of different people.
And you mentioned there people speaking about mental health issues and depression, and a lot of this podcast is about trying to offer some practical tips and advice on them. And you also mentioned the fact that you've suffered with circumstantial depression throughout the book as well. What was happening there for you? How did you fix that? Did you have therapy, Ben? Did you sort of sit down and talk to someone about that?
No, I mean, sadly, I come from a generation and from a place, I come from a backcountry farming community in rural New Zealand, and the way that mental health was framed when I was a child in the community was that if you had something that was visibly mental health issue, you were seen as damaged goods. So I was taught that talking about that stuff was bad. So unfortunately, when I went through that for the first time as a fairly young man, I didn't know what to do. I felt completely and utterly alone and really trapped in it. I think even for the first 3 months of it, I didn't probably understand that I was depressed. And as months went on, I really, really did. And I remember I was really having a hard time getting out of bed. And this kind of bittersweet but beautiful thing happened. And I felt like we were looking for a new mussel supplier. And I've told the story before, but a friend of mine who's now passed, Jason, picked me up from my house. He was a fishmonger and took me to a mussel farm. And I met the farmer on the boat there, a man called Lance Whiffen. And I don't know if Lance could sense something was wrong with me or not, but he just started to talk to me in very open and honest terms. Lance was probably 25 years older than me, and he told me, about how hard his life had been, how the first time round with his family, he was working so much that he really missed out on his children's childhood. But at age 60, he had had another child, and he was really determined to not make the same mistakes again. And there was about 9 months into my bout of depression, and it was really the first thing that kind of cut through the funk that I'd been in. And there was a whole heap of other problems, Ryan, at the time as well, like a breakdown in my relationship with the owner of Attica and a sort of a toxic work culture, which really was my own fault because I wasn't managing people properly and I was failing the staff as a leader. And I'm really shrunken and a disconnect from my young family. And so I suppose I learned from Lance that it was actually on me to make some changes. And I did make those changes one at a time. And slowly there was just a little bit more light. And eventually the sun would sort of break through the clouds. And it was an incredible feeling knowing that I probably was going to be okay and that I could get better. I got professional help and I recommend that to people. And actually, it's a very small achievement, but one of my proudest achievements here is that last year we were able to afford to get an employee assistance program here at Attica. And what that means is that our employees have 24-hour access to psychologists and therapists, not only for themselves, but for their family, for their partners, and for their children, and even for their parents, free of charge. And making the decision to invest in that and provide that, it actually was one of the most meaningful things. I think having gone through it and at times not being able to actually even get to a psychologist, it felt like one of the most meaningful things that I've ever done in business.
I think that's huge to be able to offer that for your staff. And I wonder why so many restaurants have this issue and don't tackle it head on, because it comes back to that issue of retention and keeping staff. I interviewed JJ Johnson recently, and he literally said to me, most of the people I've lost in my business was because of poor mental health. And if I'd done better as a leader, if I'd offered them better services, they'd still be here. Why do you think this is such a big issue in kitchens? Is it because kitchens attract a certain type of person? Or is it because of the pressures and the difficult environment that brings out those negative traits?
I think it's mostly to do with the pressure and the difficult environment would be my synopsis. I've certainly worked with plenty of people, especially in my younger career, who have been through really hard stuff, and the kitchen sort of made that worse for them. But I would say more broadly that the pressure in kitchens is undeniable. It is one of the most difficult jobs. Of course, I'm not talking about the business of being a doctor or being in a hospital, but in terms of customer expectations of restaurants, we're making complicated things. Even at their most simple, cooking is complicated. Even poaching an egg perfectly and putting it on a piece of toast and getting it to the dining room in a timely manner, that's a lot more complicated than taking off something from the shelf and selling it to somebody over a counter. People call restaurants simple businesses sometimes, which really, really annoys me, because restaurants and cafes and hospitality businesses are very complicated. They're mechanical businesses. We're the last of the boutique factory. We take raw materials and we transmute them into things that make people happy. And the people coming have such immensely high expectations of it. And there's a whole heap of sort of other external factors that really add to that pressure and ramp it up. Whatever restaurant guides are in a person's city, they seriously contribute to that pressure. And that's not hyperbole, that's fact. We all know this, and there's been some really, really sad stories about people that for some it was just too much. There does need to be a level of anxiety or pressure in a kitchen to perform, but to what end? And so anything that we can do to sort of reduce that stress as leaders, I think is meaningful and worthwhile, whilst maintaining our standards. So one of the things that has been really hard for hospitality workers traditionally is the pressure of awards and of guides. So for us, it's as simple as saying, you know what, that doesn't matter to us at all anymore. So when you're here, please do not concern yourself with that. That's a layer of pressure that you don't need when you go about your job. When you see a food critic come in and you freak out and you're filled with anxiety because you don't want to be the person that's going to screw this meal up for them or this service for them, and therefore the restaurant's going to get a negative review and maybe it's not going to survive. You just don't need that on your shoulders, It's actually not your responsibility anyway. So let's just say carte blanche, we don't care about that. That removes a layer of anxiety that's meaningful. If we're making food in the kitchen and we have a big brigade like Attica does, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.
I really wanted to speak about this. I think you say something about balancing peas on top of each other. No, isn't there
Yeah,
a
well,
line like that in the
just
book?
like when you survey the landscape, especially this is really fine dining stuff, but like when you survey the landscape of fine dining, you can just scroll through Instagram to see. Like you'll see some people doing some absolutely ridiculous things that aren't meaningful in any way, shape, or form. And the example that I give in the book is this photo that I once saw of like this fillet of perfectly cooked fish with, I'm exaggerating, but it equated to like 10,000 tiny baby peas perfectly stacked on top of that piece of fish. And I just thought, that's terror, right? Like that's absolute terror. Having to stack those damn peas on top of there every single night, it's just unnecessary to me. It's unnecessary. And it's ego, really. And so questioning what really supports your cooking and is essential to it, and what is just kind of ego or just because you can, and really like surveying that because of what it can do to the people making that and what it can do to the pressure that they're under during service and their mental health. And coming back to the peas, I'm not saying don't be ambitious. You can still shell 10,000 baby peas if you want, but don't make one person shell all those damn peas. Bring in a group of 10 or 15, or if you only have 5 in your kitchen, do them together. Share the load of the menial, mind-boggling, boring tasks. Don't push them to the apprentice. Turn a negative into a positive by sharing it. Put some music on. Everybody gets the peas out. They can talk. They can have a laugh while they're shelling all the peas as quickly as they can. And that 5-hour job becomes a 30-minute job. And that's how we do it at Attica, and we've done it like that for a very long time. And the reason why we do it is because I would be concerned that I might destroy somebody by forcing them to do that terribly boring, monotonous task forever. It's just not responsible. So for me, it's just a simple reframing. It's not a revolutionary idea. And if you can do that kind of time and time again, I think you can reduce stress. I think also the way that the leader is behaving in the workplace is absolutely crucial. So people come here and they freak out about how calm this place is. Like somebody came in the other day during service and I was talking to them and it was so calm, and they said, "Oh, it's so calm, but it can't be like this all the time." And I said, "It is like this all the time. This is how it is. It's calm and it's focused." And they're like, and I'm like, "No, this is how it is. This is really how it is. You can come back when I'm not here and it will be the same. It's how it is." It's the tone that I set, the tone that I asked the team to set. Yeah, it's just like, again, coming back to like a long-term view. How long do you think a person can shell 100 kilos of baby peas for? I mean, I don't know.
It sounds so
do
obvious. It sounds so obvious, but it's not the case in so many restaurants, is it? That you
No,
are
but it's such a
broken with the
simple
menial
thing. It's just-
tasks.
Yeah, but it's just really like if you view all people as equal, so probably the one thing that I haven't talked about is a slight undoing of hierarchy as well, because the head chef and the sous chef and the chef de parties and the owner all have to be prepared to shell those peas, right? They do. And how do the sous chef and the head chef become prepared to shell those peas, Ryan? They do because the owner will, right? So it's really simple like that. It's just basic leadership stuff.
There's a bit of like pushing ego to the side a little bit,
Yeah.
no? And also getting out of that, because I find often it's like, well, I had to shell the peas, so they have to now shell the peas. It's this cycle that just gets repeated throughout kitchen cultures that get passed on.
Yeah, no, and that's just not a caring mentality. Like I worked in many kitchens where if I was going down, then I'd be let almost just to get crushed and fail. That never, ever happens here. Like hand on heart, like you're not going to go down because the team won't allow it, because they'll pitch in and somebody's just got to put their arm up and hand up and say, "I'm not going to make it." And no problem. The sous chefs will come over. Everybody will kind of rip in and share those jobs and get that person to where they need to be. And then maybe have a constructive conversation about how they could get to where they need to be. It's all just about performance though as well, right? Like I think that coming back to that earlier comment about those English chefs saying that we were soft, and they were also kind of saying that because they knew that we did this thing called staff speeches, which seemed namby-pamby to them. And what they didn't know though was that this is all about performance. Because crushing somebody and breaking somebody's soul, that's not about performance. That's about stupidity. That doesn't need to happen. That's just a stupid decision to let that happen to somebody. It's about performing better as a team. It's about being connected. It's about bringing everybody up to create something great on behalf of the guest. I tell you, Ryan, like if there's one thing that I hear a lot, whatever criticism people have of our restaurant, the one thing that I hear a lot about is the connectedness of the team, the pride that they have in the place. So the connectedness comes from we work for each other. Like that's on behalf of the guest. We work for each other. We're a team.
Heard, Chef.
Chef heard.
Thanks for listening to Heard, the podcast that aims to put the rest in restaurants. This episode is sponsored thanks to San Pellegrino and Accor, two brands that care passionately about the restaurant industry.
Heard, yeah. I got that. Don't worry.
Hearing Ben talk about the culture that he's created at Attica, I can't help thinking that that's it. That's the right path. This is exactly the kind of leader we've been looking for in Heard. Ben's come through some tough times in the kitchen himself and then gone on to change things in his own business. But it's not just about leadership within the kitchen walls. There's also all these outside pressures. There's a really explosive chapter in Ben's book where he talks about the award systems, and he's particularly scathing about what he calls jimmies. A jimmy in Ben's shorthand is for a restaurant critic or a food journalist who doesn't have the knowledge to be doing their job they're doing. Imagine how that feels, to be openly, publicly criticised by someone who doesn't understand the culinary aspects of what you're creating. This, to Ben, is called a jimmy. And instead, he'd like critics with knowledge who spend their time trying to elevate the industry rather than leeching off it, which, you have to admit, many of them do. I read that chapter and it personally caused a fair amount of soul searching within me. In the last episode of Heard, we talked all about the impact that food media can have on romanticising and normalising bad behaviour in the kitchen, with many young chefs quoting from TV shows like Hell's Kitchen, The Menu, or The Bear, or books like Kitchen Confidential. I've heard from a lot of chefs that food media can lead to some unhealthy attitudes over how you behave in kitchens. And Ben's got some really strong and honest opinions about the tortured trope, that stereotype of the struggling, passionate, egotistical, artistic, even crazy sometimes chef.
We are not tortured artists. That is not an acceptable mentality. But I do take issue with the portrayal of us and about how that outlaw, rogue, gunslinging, drinking, drug taking kind of trope stereotype of chefs is celebrated in the culture. I think it is damaging and harmful. And that's why I wrote about Kitchen Confidential, or parts of Kitchen Confidential, which, if you read sections of the book now, it's unmistakably misogynistic. And at the very least, it just says that women are not welcome in kitchens. And I wrote that because I kept on hearing, and I hear generations of young men, and men of all ages, frankly, worshipping the book. And I'm sure that there's parts of it that are worth it, but not those parts. And when I read it the first time, I didn't agree with it. And so that's just one small part of it. But I think when we have issues like misogyny, like sexual harassment, like gender imbalance in workplaces and in ownership of restaurants, we need to try to start to consider what the root causes are if we are ever going to make significant changes. And so examining that after dealing with, in the book, a chapter called The Pig, where my wife Kylie bravely shares a story of really terrible sexual harassment by a former boss. It's not okay to, for me at least, here's this example, this awful example of a woman being treated terribly, and that's it. I want to try to kind of offer a way forward in a way and to talk about this and bring it out into the open a little bit, because frankly, we don't talk about it enough, and it's still happening with great regularity. And I know that because I hear about it, and so does my wife. And so, to the best availability, it's something we'd be able to stamp out here. You can never say 100%. Like I said, it's not a set and forget thing. You've got to keep an eye on the culture.
I think the good thing there is that Bourdain at least owned that in the future. He seemed to admit that what he'd done wasn't quite correct. I mean, it obviously came after the drummings of Me Too, where everybody was worried about everything they'd done in the past. But at least I think he never shied away from saying, hey, I'm sorry
No,
I did this.
I think there was some self-reflection. I wish that he'd published excerpts in his book to talk about his changing views on sexism and on what he wrote, but he didn't. But, I do write too that the book is not the man. That was a snapshot of the man in time, and we all evolve as humans. So how strongly we can be judged for that sort of thing in the past, I'm not sure. But the book still exists, and it sold well over 1 million copies, Ryan. So it's a significant influence in our culture. And I think it offers significant validation for young men or men of any age who have the wrong thinking, who are looking for it.
Creates this weird, like, we are pirates culture. This happened to me in an interview recently and I said, look, dude, that's really doing yourself a disservice.
It is.
Like, pirates died young of dysentery. You don't want to hold yourself up as a pirate. This is creative. This is a passionate industry. This is an industry that nurtures and cares for us, the diner. It does like you say, it's connected so well to community. And then I hear so many chefs be like, yeah, but we're pirates. And it's so sad.
What they're doing, though, is that they're reducing themselves to their worst parts. And that is heartbreaking, especially for those of us who don't behave like pirates. And there's a lot of us that don't behave like pirates. There's probably, maybe, hopefully, there's now more that don't behave like pirates than do. And it really sort of holds back the profession. This is a job that I'm completely committed to and have been almost my whole life. And so it's upsetting to see that. I also kind of don't love it when somebody either sort of tells our story for us as they're heading out the door, i.e. they're not going to be cooking in restaurants anymore, or when they tell our story when they're not from our culture. We don't actually have that many opportunities to tell our story. And that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was really to kind of go, you know what, this is how I see it, especially like how I see the tremendous things we do. And there are so many tremendous things that cooks and waiters do. And cooks are some of the most resilient people that I know and have some of the most incredible problem-solving abilities on the planet. And they don't even know it, because they at the same hand, they would call themselves pirates and outlaws. And they're really not. They're people making food in the kitchen. But the chef's life is such a state of fluid failure that the level of resilience that most chefs have is sort of unimaginable to the regular person. And that's something really to be super proud of. Chefs are consummate problem solvers, and most of the time they'll give you a big smile while they're doing it. We should really, while not glossing over or ignoring the darker sides, we do have an overall too much of a focus on it. We don't celebrate those people who are doing tremendous work. I was just very recently on a North American book tour, and I went to a restaurant in Nashville called Rolf and Daughters. And I really was so impressed by the culture that I didn't know them beforehand. I just met them. We did an event there, and I was so impressed by the culture of the restaurant, by the connectedness of the team, the enthusiasm that everybody had for the workplace. It offered such hope, actually, to be honest. I was just like, this is where it's at. This is awesome. This is
what
how
was
we
it
can
particularly
be.
about this place, Ben? What was it?
Oh, man, it was that they had a very good leader, Chef Philip, who sets a good standard, who doesn't act like a dick. And everything was kind of flowing from there. There was just good intentions there. They cared about their work a lot, but they cared about each other a lot. They had excellent working conditions. And of course, I was around for a day when they weren't running the restaurant. And then at night we went for dinner and I felt it again. These things are always related. But I'd never read an article about how great the culture at Rolf and Daughters is. Why haven't I? Why aren't we writing these articles, right? Why aren't we celebrating people like Philip and that restaurant who are doing incredible work? Why are we always just writing about the negative stuff. It's infuriating, like tell some
All
good
the
stories.
leaders that are not doing that work that have got the best PR. And I've been guilty of that. I've been a Jimmy in the past, Ben. And there's a few conversations I've had doing this series where I went to bed and I was like, shit, have I done enough? Have I positively impacted rather than leeching off the industry? The chefs that we often put up on a pedestal, we don't need to mention names, they're the worst offenders often in the background, but they have the best PR, they tell the best stories, and they've worked out how to control media that's not actually got a lot of integrity left because there's no money in the game. So everyone's doing it for Instagram. Everyone's doing it for the pictures. The amount of journalists now that don't actually publish, it's 2 paragraphs on Instagram to go underneath a picture. And that picture was taken because they got given a free meal. The lack of money in the industry, also the power of PR, and the fact that you're chained to your desk, you're not encouraged to go out there and interview these people. You get everything fed to you through press releases. It's a really sad thing for all of journalism, but particularly food journalism. And I've been struggling with that because I left the website I was at a few years ago. What am I going to do next? I really want to do something that at least impacts the industry in a positive way. And I've had a few conversations where I interviewed Greg Backstrom from Olmsted, and he was like, where's the publication? Where's the institution that's helping us with this stuff? There's always all these stupid awards. I'm sort of paraphrasing him, but that's what he said. Who gain from the industry? Who's trying to give back a little bit? And it's a real sad state of affairs. And it's something I've had to come to terms with as well, that like I didn't do enough when I was acting as a journalist. And this is probably my staff speech to you right now. That if I was giving
go on.
that's me being vulnerable and sort of saying, yeah, it leaves a real distaste in my mouth. I've tried to speak about these issues. It's been something I've been passionate about, but I didn't do enough. And I fell for the bullshit of PR a little bit too much. And I see why. And I was in a more privileged position. I'd come from news journalism. I had a salary, which many food writers don't even have a salary. They're freelance. I should have used my position in a better way. I can't even be harsh to these journalists because they're not being paid. They're not being trained. The only way they can exist is accepting those free trips from PR and going in a room with 25 other journalists. And if you think you can get a good story when 25 journalists are all in the same room, you're being spoon-fed the lines that PR want you to write about. Also, your book also made me think, I was like, fuck, have I been a Jimmy? How Jimmy am I? Like, kept me up for a little bit, that one, mate.
Oh, well, I think it's big of you to admit that, though, Ryan, because in the book, I try to admit my own culpability in every situation. I think it's one thing to point the finger at people. I think it's another thing to sort of find yourself in the system, examine it, and think about what you could do about it. And the chapter you're referring to, Bats and Hats, it was a pretty terrifying thing to write. Kylie and I sat with what I'd written for a couple of years before we decided to let it rip and let it be published. And
why terrifying? Because of the potential repercussions of it?
Yeah, because of the repercussions, and certainly people have been very unhappy about it. Change is difficult. People don't want to change, Ryan. They don't want to self-reflect, particularly people in positions of power. And so I always knew there would be backlash. I thought that people might be a little bit more mature than they've been, but that's okay. When you're on the
because
right
they've had
side
so
of
much
things.
smoke blown up their ass, they all think they're dragons. That's the truth. My dad says that. If I blow enough smoke up your ass, you'll think you're a fucking dragon. He says that to me all the time. And I think we did. We spent years just having smoke blown up our ass, and suddenly we think we're important, and that's not the case whatsoever. I still remember, and I think I've told you this before, and I loved it, but other people didn't. I came to Melbourne, the circus arrived, and everyone put on the show, and we came to Attica. And I would say that night you probably had 15, maybe 20 voters, people of so-called importance in the restaurant. And I remember you coming to the table on like dish 4 and you said, all right, I'll see you later. My son's got a basketball game tonight. And you left. And I remember people being like, I can't believe he's left. And I'm like, I fucking love that he's left. Like, that's priorities, no? And I think it was a little, not a jab, but it was a way of showing that like, that's not as important as my son's basketball game. And I thought that was beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Ryan. I love that memory. Thank you. Yeah, and it's true. Like,
I still remember the cabbage dish as well, though. Like
the cabbage bolognese. Yeah. There was a line from Maya Angelou that's a really famous line, but it's so true. It's that, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like people will forget what you did, what you said, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I'm acutely aware that really what's important is the long term. In that moment with my child, I can't get that back. And as a chef, I'd already missed so much of it. So when I became an owner, I'm like, you know what? Like, I work real hard at this thing. Like, I've been here since 7 a.m. this morning. It's probably 6 o'clock now. Service is about to start. But realistically, I don't really need to be here past 8. It's still an incredibly long day. But if my kid has something on, one of my kids has something on, I can go to that, and...
But mate, 99.9% of chefs would not have left their restaurant at that point. They would have taken that exceptionally serious, and I loved it. I thought it was a real show of living by example, leading by example. I thought it was really powerful.
Thank you. Well, last thing I'd say on that is that this restaurant, it doesn't define me. It's not me. It's not everything. I put a lot into it, but like, I've trained this team. We've built this, all the things we've talked about today. Like, what does it stand for if you can't go to your kid's basketball game? Because some so-called important people are in your restaurant? I already said hello to them. Like, I wasn't really going to influence their meal anymore by staying. And anyway, it was more important to me to go to Kobe's game. I definitely want to be known as a person that lives their values, but also that I view this, and all of these things are viewed in a very long-term way, in terms of like, if I want to be able to do this until I'm 60, I'm not sure if I do, but if I do, then it's got to be like this because it's sustainable.
Heard, chef.
Chef heard.
Preempting the comment section, probably a repeat of those English guys who called you pussies. What would you say to people who are like, no, not this is just idealistic, this is overly sensitive, we're pirates. Like, I want you to speak directly to those chefs who have a position where they could change things, but are kind of stuck in the old ways and the old ways of thinking. How do you crack that shell, Ben?
Oh, man. I mean, I feel like their time is over. Things are changing. And, you can get on board and change for the right reasons, or that change will come for you and you won't have a place here anymore. I'm not going to get into it with people in the comment section. I could give a shit. Like, I've been around a long time, so I've got a pretty thick skin, right? I've been at the center of a maelstrom more than once in my career. And so I think when you know that you're on the right side of something, then say la vie, right? A little bit. But like, I think everybody has the opportunity and the ability to be better, including me. We all have our blind spots, but if we have people in our lives that care about us, they'll help us point them out. And a bit of self-reflection on our actions goes a really long way. I don't think that humans are bad innately. Like, I don't think that chefs are bad. But when your significant mentors perhaps have taught you the wrong way, and that's what you think, I just say to people that have that it's never too late to change. It's never too late to listen, and it's never too late to be better. And I think I'm a good example of it. Far from perfect, but like, I'm somebody that spent a lot of time in my life listening to people less fortunate than I. And I keep them kind of in my heart a little bit, because in those bad days, you think, well, things are getting pretty tough for me today or whatever. And then you remember how much tougher it is for somebody else. And that's a powerful motivation to do the right thing and to keep it in perspective.
And you mentioned self-reflection. I think there's also a moment of, and it's the thing I'm trying to push actually in the last couple of episodes, we're really trying to push it, self-compassion. Form healthy habits for yourself.
Yeah.
You don't care about yourself.
That's something that I'm still working on, like, I mean, I know how to do it, but you've read the book, so you realize that there's self-loathing in the book, and there's ways that I talk to myself sometimes that aren't actually verbal, and it's pretty disgusting. I guess, like, come back to the common sense. You can't really hurt me because of how rough I am on myself, and sometimes, like, at different times in my life how much I've hated myself as well. And it was quite painful to write that and then to narrate it as well. But the thing about it was about sharing it and opening up and being vulnerable, like you said about these things, is that a whole heap of people have come to me since and said, oh man, I never heard anybody talk about themselves like that. I talk about myself like that often. What can I do about it? And I think in all honesty, one of the ways that I've overcome my own self-loathing has been actually writing down what I said. Because, man, it was confronting when I actually wrote down what I was saying to myself in my mind. Like, I don't even want to repeat the words in this podcast, but let's just say it's as vicious as you can be. And when I wrote it down, it was more shocking to me. Kylie had sort of witnessed it once or twice as well, and she was really taken back. So she's helped me hugely. But since writing about it and talking about it, I feel like I kind of got a handle on it. So I think this is kind of the moral of the story, isn't it? Just sort of have a conversation with somebody about what you're going through is just so helpful.
Well, sharing, it immediately diminishes the problem as soon as you share it.
Does. We're also like self-absorbed and wound up in what's going on. We think we're the only people in the world having this conundrum. And the reality is that millions of us going through exactly the same experience.
And do you know where it comes from? That have you ever identified what gave you that characteristic?
I think I'm much, much more driven than I would have liked to admit. I thought I never had any ambition. And if I'm being honest, through my life, I've realized that I'm really driven and really ambitious, and I need to find ways to temper that, and that's just being completely honest. It comes out when I'm not meeting my own expectations for myself. It never comes out at anybody else. That's the thing. I'm not sure what it is, but it always.
Were you always like that, even as a child, or is this?
I don't remember it. No, I wonder if it's being a chef that's made me like that. I don't think so. I think it's probably if I was a carpenter or an artist or a musician, I'm sure that I would feel the same way. But I would say that, come back to finish up, really sharing it, dialing down. Writing is a cathartic thing for me. I think when we write, it's completely different than how we talk. And writing allows you to really drill down on your thoughts and ideas in a way that you cannot from talking.
Going back to all of these little changes you've made in yourself as a leader, in your team, in the gender, all of the culmination of everything we've just discussed and you discuss in the book, what's been the impact of that on your business?
It really could be defined by the word quality, and really a redefining of that word, because historically we've defined quality in restaurants, chefs and waiters and food critics and guides and everybody in our ecosystem has defined quality solely by what is on the plate and how it's served. And that to me is a very, very flimsy definition of quality. Because quality to me is about taking care of all things. Your people, the planet, your community, and the environment. That's really where quality sits. It's not just about what's on the plate. It's about how all of that came to be, and if it had good intentions, and whether or not a bunch of things were hurt and destroyed in the process. Because if it can come to the plate and to the best availability of all those things can be taken care of, that's the definition of quality. And I think that when people choose to come to a restaurant like Attica, that their base level expectation should be that those things, that quality, are taken care of for them.
And final one we ask everybody. If I gave you a blank check, what would you do to impact the restaurant industry in a more positive way in regards to wellness and all the things we've been discussing?
If I had a blank check, I would use it to teach chefs and waiters how to become entrepreneurs, how to own businesses. I actually think that's a fundamental problem with our industry. Like so many of us don't feel like it's our place to own a company. We're not raised up. We're workers. We come from working class, and the expectations of us are not that we become founders of companies and successful business people. And it's two-pronged for me. It's very, very important that chefs and waiters own restaurants and not business people. That's crucial. We have to own our own excellence. And secondly, just that we can improve our lives as well through owning our own restaurants and doing our own thing. And it would lead to a more interesting and delicious future for us. That's where our education is. That's the major lacking area, is that we just don't know how to do it. And I didn't know how to do it. You know, I could have very well not be here today because of my lack of confidence in business and just having to overcome a lot of insecurity about it that I shouldn't have had. I should have, you know, it should have been part of my education as a young chef.
It's crazy you say that and you say it at the end, because the plan is that season 2 will focus on business. And I've been having cold feet on it because I'm like, have we done enough on the wellness issues, on the mental health? And I was saying it to my producer the other day and she was like, no, business is the right move. And I was in between, and then you speaking like that about it, I'm like, it is.
Oh no, man, it's
perfect transition for season 2.
The trick is to get chefs interested in it. That's the trick. You know, like, hey, this is how it can be. Like, you can change things, real things, you know? It's rad. If you want to spend more on food costs, if you can afford it, then that's up to you. I know the rules say that it can't be more than 33% or whatever, but if you want to spend 40 because you really love this, you can do that if it's your own business. If it's not your business, no, it's got to be at 23, you know, whatever. Like, but that would be the frame that I would be trying to, one, you benefit your life, you could do better. 2, you can make your own rules, you can reinvent things, but until you own the business, you have no purchase over anything of importance. And that very, very much comes from my entire career up until the point in 2015 when I became the owner here.
I hope that Ben has inspired you. He's certainly inspired me across that conversation. And I'm left with this idea that creativity, bravery, a little bit of imagination is the answer. Not just to what's happening within kitchens, but for actually most of the world's problems. And Ben certainly put his creativity to good use when it comes to turning a toxic culture around. And like Ben says, he's taken his time over this. He hasn't tried to tackle everything at once. He's broken it down into small, manageable chunks. It's 10 years down the line now since Ben took over as the owner of Attica, and he can put his hand on his heart and say that the restaurant is now a business that's doing its best to make its own internal culture a better place. And remember, if you need mental health support or you just want to sit down and have a chat with somebody, please check out Southern Smoke. They're a wonderful 501c3 that runs free mental health programs for people who work in the US restaurant industry. Just visit southernsmoke.org. Thanks for listening to Heard, the podcast that aims to put the rest in restaurants. Next time, in our series finale, we're bringing you our first ever Heard debate. We're going to sit down with a bunch of wonderful chefs and ask them what they think of all of the issues we've discussed and raised across this podcast.
All the social problems get exacerbated in the restaurant world.
Michelle came up to me one day and she's like, hey, freeze your eggs.
What happens when everything you've sacrificed doesn't pan out?
Wait a second, has this happened to you? This podcast was produced and hosted by me, Ryan King, produced by the enigmatic Helen Brown, and sponsored by San Pellegrino and Accor, 2 brands that care passionately about the restaurant industry. Please remember to rate, review, and share to spread the word about Heard.